Julian, I want to start with you. As we come up on Monday, can you just get us up to speed on where you think the oil markets are headed and what we should expect to see?
As you alluded to earlier, I think this very much depends on the narrative that comes out of the White House, which seems to be affecting oil prices, and the continued closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And I think those two things are going to weigh on oil prices. You can perhaps add to that any damage that is sustained to oil production and transportation in the Middle East, and possibly any attacks from Houthi rebels in Yemen, who seem now to have entered the conflict. And if they start attacks on ships in the southern Red Sea again, then that could have an impact too. So it's very much going to depend on how those factors play off against each other. We've seen a lot of volatility in prices over the last 3 to 4 weeks, and I think we will continue to see that volatility as we go ahead. The one thing I think is undeniable is that the longer this goes on and the longer the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed to traffic, the more upward pressure there will be on oil prices and the more difficult it will be to see those coming down quickly.
Julian, I want to ask you about something that I asked Jaman about just a few minutes ago, and that is the amount of oil going through the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia, 7 million barrels a day. That was the target, the goal for that pipeline. I'm curious sort of what that does to the flow of oil in the region, having that up and running to that degree. As an aside, I'm also curious why it's been Saudi Arabia that has done the most kind of contingency planning for something like this, to have a pipeline, to have another route for its oil to go, unlike some of these other nations.
To answer your first question, what this does, it provides something of a lifeline, a partial lifeline, both for Saudi Arabia and for the wider world. 7 million barrels a day. Out of that, about 2 million will be used domestically. That pipeline feeds refineries in Riyadh and along the Red Sea coast. So about 2 million barrels a day of that will go to those. The other 5 will go for export. Before the war, their exports out of Yanbu were about 700, 800,000 barrels a day. So, that gives you somewhere at around 4.25 million barrels a day of Saudi exports that have been diverted from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea. That's about 60% of what they were exporting has been diverted. That's certainly a help. The worry is, as I mentioned earlier, the potential for attacks on tankers in the southern Red Sea. Almost all of these exports that we've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks are going south out of Yanbu. They're going towards Saudi Arabia's Asian market. So they would be at risk if the Houthis do step up attacks on tankers. Why is Saudi Arabia the only country that has this big pipeline to the Red Sea? Geography. They're the only one with a Red Sea coast. The UAE has a pipeline that goes across from its Persian Gulf coast to its Arabian Sea coast, but it was already using that to more than half of its capacity. We think it's added sort of 700,000 or 800,000 barrels a day to what it's shipping through that line. Whether it can sustain that in the long term is unclear. They've not tried it before, and equally nor have the Saudis at the level they're doing now. Kuwait has no other good way out without crossing somebody else's territory. And I think the political difficulties that have bedeviled Iraq since the toppling of Saddam Hussein have made it very difficult for them to revive exports out through Turkey, which used to be a fairly substantial export route for them.
And for now, at least, as we spoke about earlier, it seems like the Houthis are holding to that truth from 2022 with Saudi and not hitting that port, but we'll have to see if that holds. Philip, I want to talk to you because on a recent episode of the Odd Lots podcast, you talked about the risk to the petrochemical supply chain, specifically the global supply of ethylene, which is known as the world's most important chemical. Why is that, and how is it being impacted?
Well, it's impacted on multiple fronts. So firstly, just for a little bit of understanding of what we're talking about, ethylene underpins especially the global plastics industry via what's called polyethylene. We don't need to get into too much detail, but food packaging, even for a lot of infrastructure projects, all of them require a lot of ethylene. And what we're seeing in practicality right now is a lot of impact on multiple fronts. So firstly, we have the direct exports of those polymers, not of ethylene directly, but of the chemicals that ethylene are turned into. And we're talking about roughly 12 to 13% of the global market being directly cut off from the Middle East. So for comparison, that's roughly the equivalent of what Europe in its entirety consumes. That's basically cut off entirely. So that's already one major impact. Then secondly, tied to oil, you have direct cutoff from crude oil, which in Asian refineries are turned into petrochemical feedstocks called naphtha principally. Thirdly, you have direct naphtha exports, with the Middle East being the world's largest exporter of this petrochemical feedstock, again, principally going to Asia. And to make it even more convoluted, another major chemical feedstock is called, well, liquefied petroleum gas, which is kind of an umbrella term for propane, butane. Long story short, those two are also used a lot in cooking, especially in India. And that also is cut off. So that means that you have a lot of competition on this propane butane front from India. You have a direct disruption of naphtha supplies. You have a direct disruption of significant crude oil supplies. And you have a direct disruption of polymer supplies. Taking them all together, now there are a lot of numbers and assumptions that go into that. But if you pull it all together, you're talking about roughly 1/3 of global ethylene and ethylene product supplies, which could be cut off. And now we're already 3 to 4 weeks into sustained supply disruption, where we're not feeling it yet because partially a lot of ships, well, still arrived over the past couple of weeks because those things take time. It takes 20 days roughly to go from the Persian Gulf, from the Middle East Gulf to South Korea or East Asia. So a lot of it still has to manifest, but we're likely going to see a very significant impact over the next couple of weeks.
Philip, talk a bit more about that impact. So you've laid out very clearly here the amount of dislocation that's happening here as a result as we look at these second and third order effects. What is that going to mean for consumers in London, where you are, for those of us here in New York? So how are companies, again, downstream from the oil producers, how are they going to be, how and when are they going to be reckoning with all of this?
Yeah, so on the how, I think it's important to emphasize the regional differences. For Asia, it will most likely, and we're going to get to the when in a bit, but it will most likely turn into really a security of supply concern, especially for those chemicals that are foundational to, well, meeting the basic needs of society. And I would be particularly concerned about food packaging here. So that's probably top of mind for really Asia. For Europe and the US, it's a bit more tricky because to me, it seems reasonable to assume they're not immediate supply concerns yet. But obviously, there will be a very strong pull from Asia because Asia will have a very significant immediate shortage that will drive up its prices, and that will pull a lot away from the US and Europe. Now, what this means for consumers, to me, it stands to reason that you'll just see it will be a very strong upward effect on prices across the board. It will have a very strong inflationary effect. How strong, that's a big question mark for me, as to me it's also quite an unprecedented scenario. And we obviously still have to see how things play out further down the line. When it comes to the when, right now, the impact is still pretty muted. At least when it comes to also the price movements, a lot again has been driven by sentiment, not so much a physical shortage yet. That will probably manifest over the next weeks. And then with plastics, you also have a slight delay because you have some inventories that can be withdrawn. Now, taking all of that into account, probably the impact will really ramp up from April onward. And then depending on how things go, it will just worsen by the month. May, June, at this point also almost seems like a given that there will be very significant impact, first and foremost in Asia, but also further downstream in Europe and the US.
Okay. Julian, I want to ask you, we don't have a ton of time, but the CEO of Chevron was at CERAWeek, this big oil convention in Houston, and was asked to compare this conflict with the conflict, with the supply disruption when the conflict in Ukraine started. And he said there was a difference because there was still a constant supply happening there. What is your take on that? Is this worse? Is this different? Compare and contrast, please.
Oh, this is much different and much worse. As I said, there was a constant supply of oil out of Russia during and has been throughout the Ukraine war. What we've seen there is a diversion of supply from European markets to Asian markets, and a deliberate attempt by successive US administrations not to impact the overall volume of flow. I mean, that's been very deliberate. What we've seen with Hormuz is a slashing of the amount of oil that is available on the world market, regardless of where it goes.